Hi guys. Hi. Good morning. So thanks for coming to the second event of the Nebrija-Santander Global Chair on Migration and Human Rights. I'm Diego Acosta. I'm the director of this chair and also a professor on European and Migration Law at the University of Bristol. And today, actually, I'm very pleased to be welcoming also my students from Notre Dame and the rest of you guys from Nebrija and from other universities here in Madrid, but also especially our guest speakers today who are not only excellent and leading academics in their areas, but they are also good friends. So it's a double pleasure, if you like. So let me first of all introduce Jacopo Martire, who will be speaking first. He's a senior lecturer at the University of Bristol. He has held a number of positions in different universities around the world, NYU, the New School in New York, Rosario in Bogotá, Roma Tre in Rome, Di Tella in Buenos Aires, etc. He is a legal and political theorist. His initial interests were on Foucault, but now he's also writing a book which fits perfectly the topic today. The book is called The Search for a European People, and it will be published with Hart Publishers in the coming months. And Jacopo will be the first speaker today. After Jacopo, we will have Professor Kochenov. Dimitry Kochenov leads the rule of law research at the CEU Democracy Institute in Budapest, and he is also a professor of legal studies at the same university in Vienna. He is right now a visiting professor at Chicago Law School. Well, Dimitry has published widely on citizenship, on the rule of law, on EU migration. He has also held a number of fellowships at different places: Princeton, NYU, Oxford, Luis, Turin, Osaka, UNAM in Mexico, and many others. So he will be our second speaker today, and it's also obviously a great pleasure to have him here. And our third speaker will be Dr. Sara Ganti, who is FWO postdoctoral fellow at the Human Rights Center at Ghent University. She's also a research affiliate at the Democracy Institute in Budapest. She is also now doing her second PhD, so a JSD in, I'm always pronouncing this wrong, in Yale University. I hope I pronounced that more or less. Sara works, her research is on migration, immigration law, social justice, anti-discrimination law, and citizenship law. And she will be our third speaker today. Each of the speakers will take the floor for around 20 minutes, and then we will have plenty of time for questions, debate, comments, etc. So without further ado, Jacopo, the floor is yours.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So, good morning, everyone. Diego, thank you very much for inviting us. It is a pleasure being here with you and Dimitry and Sara. And it's a pleasure to be here in Madrid, a city I love, and to this beautiful university, and to discuss something as interesting as the problem of the European people within the European Union. My presentation would be probably the most theoretical one, the most philosophical one, so I beg for a bit of patience on this, but eventually I will lead on to why this is important for law. Now, it is a well-trodden trope that the European Union has experienced a long decade of crisis. The migrant crisis, the euro crisis, the rule of law crisis, Brexit, which is indeed another kind of crisis. And a lot of suggestions have been made of what to do about this state of affairs and how to change the European Union so that it might survive and thrive. And without getting too much into detail, we can say that basically proposals for reform have been divided into two camps. One camp, which we can name Less Europe, argues for basically a disentanglement of the European project to a more Europe à la carte, to a stripped-down version of integration that so far has been pursued. People from very different perspective, like Maione and Strecht, very different perspective, one basically a liberal and the other one of the representative of the hard wing of German sociologists, have asked for less Europe and a return basically to a kind of more flexible national state system, whereas other people like Fabrini or Habermas have suggested that actually we need more Europe, but a better Europe, a different Europe that is restructured institutionally to address the problems that they see as fundamental in the, as a hurdle to the development of the European project. Now, I would say that I am on the more Europe camp. However, I disagree exactly with the kind of diagnosis that the people on the more Europe camp suggest, because what they try to fix is basically the institutional structure of the European Union. Rein in the European Council, give more power to the European Parliament, changes like that. And I am not entirely sure that that is exactly what we need. As a matter of fact, I think that that might be a kind of paradoxical trap for the European Union. My suggestion is that the European Union is basically suffering a sort of autoimmunitary crisis. And here's where philosophy starts to emerge. In the sense that the very way in which the European project has been set up has fostered an idea of the other, understood as the subject not immediately belonging to the national community, that has proven as a political and ideological stumbling block to the formation of a European people. In this perspective, I argue that the European Union has been built along immunitary lines that have made the figure of the European other an unassimilable alien subject, therefore dooming the possibility of a European people and therefore a united Europe from the start. The various echoing crises that have plagued the European Union in the long last decade are therefore to be read as a sort of autoimmunitary disease that, developed within Europe, is now turning against Europe itself. So, where does idea of immunity, community, and autoimmunity comes from? Well, it comes from the ideas and the theories developed by Roberto Esposito, an Italian philosopher who has questioned the idea of community traditionally held in political philosophy as a space where people share common identities, qualities, spaces, and so on and so forth. Esposito explored the idea of the etymological roots of the words communitas, highlighting that at its core lies the concept of the munus, a personal gift that each member must offer to the community in order to constitute the community itself. In the sense, the community is not the space that people sharing the same thing belong to, but rather the space formed by a communal lack that unites these people. It's an expropriative phenomenon which merges its members on a basis of a constitutive lack. This munus, this giving up of something, however, is always accompanied by an immunity. The immunitary mechanism allows each individual to retain their sphere of autonomy and independence against the demands of the community. Therefore, there is a kind of double bind between communitas and immunitas, a knot that has structured the modern thinking about community. As Esposito says, one may well conclude that if community breaks down the barriers of individual identity, immunity is the way to rebuild them in defensive and offensive forms against any external element that threatens it. A very simple example might serve to explain better. Think about Hobbes. In Hobbes, we all give to the Leviathan the power of life and death so that we will be protected by all the others who are part of the community and all the others that are outside of the community. Now, inherent in the community, in the immunitary mechanism, is always the paradoxical reverse, autoimmunity. We have an autoimmune crisis when the immunitary system becomes excessively exclusive and exclusionary towards all other humans and environmental alterities. And now, the question I want to ask is this: is it not precisely this dynamic at the root of the European project? Was not Europe's communitarian conception a common space where all European individuals would be present, interlocked since the beginning with a counterbalancing immunitary mechanism that in fact prevented integration? Was not the munus or public obligation on the part of states to accept foreign individuals always predicated upon a system that exposed limitations to the movement and required integration conditions of migrating individuals in order to protect and perpetuate national identities and boundaries? Now, I will not fully substantiate my claim right here. Dimitry and Sarah have written extensively about this. Just a few examples. The regime of free movement has always been linked with condition on movement. The introduction of the European citizenship has been a kind of aborted project in this kind of sense. The asylum and refugee regimes is also transforming into a kind of exclusionary machine. We will see what kind of machine later on. And Brexit represents the perfect example of this, because Brexit represents the example of a state that had the most exception to the integration of the European project, and yet is the one that actually exited Europe itself. So the obvious question at this point is, why is this partial inclusion not enough? Wouldn't it seem that a partial inclusion would be better than, outright exclusion? Well, I think that the things are a little bit more difficult than it appears. Because this partial inclusion is predicated on what is called in philosophy, in political philosophy, reification. And briefly stated, the concept of reification comes, as is known, from Marxist theory and was developed chiefly by Georgi Lukács. He argued that reification occurs when a relation between people takes on the character of a thing and thus acquires a phantom objectivity, an autonomy that seems so strictly rational and all-embracing as to conceal every trace of its fundamental nature, the relationship between people. Basically, people become object, and therefore they lose their autonomy, their independence. They basically are caught in an act of forgetfulness, as Alex Honneth suggests. The problem of reification is forgetting that we are dealing with other people with real lives that are as existentially rounded as our own. And so these people become like frozen, almost sclerotized in their existence. And by framing the European other through immunitary inclusion, it appears to me that the EU has favored precisely this dynamic of reification that prevents both self-recognition and other recognition, and therefore fatally undermines the initial step that could lead to the interpenetration of European peoples and their mutual co-integration into a more unitary policy. And this can be seen, I think, both from the perspective of the European migrant and from the hosting community. From the point of view of the European migrant, and this is a personal experience because I was a European migrant, I did not belong politically. In sense, I did not have a political voice in my country of residence, which was and is the United Kingdom, until I was naturalized. Basically, I was an external subject, a subject that didn't have a way of speaking, of participating to the interest in the community and through that to the interest of the European Union, until I ceased to be an European citizen and I became a national citizen. So, in this sense, European Union does not serve in any kind of way to a real proper integration. From the point of view of the hosting community, the situation is even worse, in the sense that I function there as a kind of irritant. In what sense? In the sense that I belonged to the community, I participated to the life, I took a job, I paid my taxes, and yet I was this kind of reified silence subject that was not really speaking the voice, and I was basically absorbing resources. In this sense, the theory of reification explains exactly how partial kinds of citizenship are much more a problem than a solution. And in this sense, I would go against what, for example, Dimitry has suggested several times of giving more rights to European citizens, his battle to actually make the European citizenship something that really matters, that gives everybody the same rights. What would be the problem there if we do not link this with the fundamental right, for which also Dimitry has argued for, of voting in national elections? Well, the point is that this other, this individual that is part and is not part of the hosting political community has expanded, has taken more space, is basically drawing even more resources without giving, in the sense of exchanging ideas, values, experiences. And also think from the point of view of really the formation of a European policy. Who is the European people? Think about this for a second. Who is the European people? It is easy to say that, all national people are also European people, but that would be a kind of misconception, because what really happens, you do not become a citizen of something just by an illocutionary act. I don't become a European citizen just because somebody says, oh, you're a European citizen. I am a European citizen if I live as a European citizen. So who are the real European citizens? The ones that move from one country to the other and establish themselves in other countries and have this kind of expansive life. And these are the people that cannot really vote for a European future in the communities where they're in. And this is, for example, the intuition that post-functionalism has had in terms of European integration. What post-functionalism has said is that the spillover effect that has been proposed by functionalists, neo-functionalists, ceases at a certain point because there is no interest from national political parties to have integrative policies precisely because they don't have an electoral reference. In plain terms, why would any national party ever be seriously pro-European if there is no European that vote for them? Their reference will always be the national citizen, which will always have national conditions and problems to deal with. So, what to do about it? Well, very simply and straightforwardly, to give a right to vote to European citizens in national political elections. And this doesn't seem too far-fetched. I mean, as a matter of fact, after 5 years, why don't give people the right to vote? I mean, if we compare to the United States, the right to vote in national and federal election is much freer than what happens in the European Union. Secondly, liberalizing more the free movement of people within the European Union. And in this sense, giving fundamental rights might be a good idea, but only as a kind of second step. So demolish the idea of market citizenship and really create a kind of open border Europe. And third, and this is connected with the idea of democratic equality espoused by Elizabeth Anderson, to actually give a kind of basic European welfare state that would allow individuals to move and to participate to the lives of the communities that they choose. These are hard reforms to achieve, but if we want European Union to succeed as a kind of supranational entity that is not just an economic union of states, we need to be bold and allow the European individual to, in some sort of way, to fertilize, let's use this kind of word, to fertilize different communities where they live. We need definitely radical solution, and in this sense, Marx reminded us that to be radical is to go to the root of the matter. It is important, however, that we do not forget the second part of the quote, which reads, "For man, however, the root is man himself. Europe will stand and fall depending on the idea of the individual it will choose as its seat." Thank you.
Jacopo, Dimitry, the floor is yours.
I'm a lawyer, for which I apologize. So we go down from the idealistic vision to something that is much more basic, and that basic account will constantly conflict with simple solutions which were proposed by my dear friend. Not that I'm against. I just think that we have a risk of talking past each other, and I will explain why. Of course, with all respect and avec toute la gentillesse. So, where does Europe start in terms of the persons? Let's go back to the founding treaties, and the founding treaties concern something else compared with the European Union today. So these were global empires. So Europe had many more Europeans everywhere, just as the Belgians had the Congo, the French, well, they still have a lot of spots here and there, but also large swaths of Africa, a lot of Asia, all of Suriname, plenty of Caribbean possessions. So Europe had a totally different outline and a totally different population at the moment when the European project gets started. And this is when Europeans needed to decide, so whom is Europe for? The first and the most limiting proposal was made by Jean Monnet himself, the founder of the European idea, to some extent, and he said Europe should not be about the people at all. So let's have free movement of goods, let's have free movement of services and free movement of capital, but people should stay locked in their container societies, and free movement of people should not be about what the Europe we are building is trying to achieve. This was promptly shut down by the Italians, because the theory of proper management of the state at the time implied that you could be overpopulated. And this is exactly what the Italian state thought of itself, because Sicily had a huge chunk of illiterate population, unemployable guys, who would always be a burden for the Italian state. So what the Italians wanted to do, they wanted to get rid of those people. And they said, we're not signing anything, and there will be no Europe, and there will be no supranational project, if someone who is richer than us and who doesn't care whether those guys have any skills or not, takes those guys, making sure that they never come back. It's not only an Italian stance, it was the same in my own state, in the Netherlands. Families would get huge donations from the state. Well, Jean Monnet, everybody else, they said, why not? And that's why we have plenty of those uneducated people went into the mines. And then, of course, the European economic boom started, and all the mines closed down. So all the mines closed down, those people move freely around Europe, but actually those who don't have the social and other types of capital, they don't move, they stay where they are, so they're still in those depressed regions. But we should still salute the Italian addition to the original plan, because now it seems that Europe is selling itself as a union that is premised on the idea of moving freely between the member states, something that was hidden behind the idea of economic growth, peace, etc. But the elephant in the room was colonization, of course. Colonization is the second out of two goals of the Schuman Declaration. This is the founding document of European integration. The first goal being peace. And when you colonize, you have the other at home. You have the whole chunk of racialized population whom you don't want to admit among the white people, as it were. So that was the starting point of thinking about who Europeans are, after all the European nations agreed that actually Italians made their point well. And then a clear separation was introduced between what kind of law, in terms of European law I'm speaking, would apply to the metropole, and what kind of law, again in terms of European law, would apply to the colonies. And colonial law was supposed to be a gradual extension of European freedoms to non-European populations out of the core of the European empires. So you could be a Français africain before decolonization, but after the signing of the treaties that are the basis of the European Union. And although you are kind of French, you will not have any European rights, you will not have any free movement, you will not have any fundamental rights guarantees comparable to the French in France, etc., etc., etc. So my basic point is that once Europe started looking at the people, the core determinant of who a European is became race, because all those who didn't look, whose pigmentation of the skin was not proper enough in terms of guaranteeing their Christian appearance, Christian in the French sense, they would not fall within the ambit of the rights that the European Union is there to guarantee. That was a big problem, but this big problem resolved itself because all those territories left the empires. The empires are no more. We still have the vestiges in the treaties, the articles that allow European metropolitan centers to conclude agreements with the colonies that they still hold about the kind of free movement rights that non-white, non-Europeans under European sovereignty would have. But those agreements are not necessary anymore because the development of the law went in the direction of extension of full European citizenship to all those who used to be colonial subjects. And we see plenty of examples of that. For instance, take an island of Aruba, 20 kilometers to the north from Venezuela. It's inhabited by Dutch citizens who would not have any kind of rights under EU law if not the extension of full citizenship of what used to be the Dutch Empire, what is now the Dutch Kingdom. So you don't need a special agreement because those guys can come by showing their European documents. In this sense, you can say this problem was kind of solved, but in fact, the history of personhood in Europe is much more complicated. So first you determine the people, and this is what we have just done, and then you start thinking, what is the added value of Europe for those people? And this is probably the revolutionary starting point of EU law compared with international legal systems. I'm not saying anything new now, it's Van Genten laws, where the court reminds us very clearly that in fact, European Union law works directly and speaks directly to those who are the subjects of all the participating states, which means that as a European, you can draw rights directly from the European level of the law. And this is a huge added value, because you can also go against your own state. You can also go against the neighboring state. You can always claim something that potentially you are otherwise not given. And this is the added value in terms of rights. But of course, going directly to some other legal system is not the only thing. If you think about the territory of rights that European law gives you, then it's a totally different scale of rights production and rights extension. Think about an Estonian national in the state of Estonia. It's a very successful state, but it's a microscopic economy. And if you only have rights in Estonia, non-discrimination, participation in the economic life of the state, political rights, etc., whatever rights you have, those rights are not to be compared with the rights that the European level provides, because there are hundreds and hundreds of Estonians if you compare the size of the economy, etc. So in their capacity of European citizens, Estonian citizens can be admitted as if they were at home in France, in Spain, in Ireland, anywhere they want to go in the European Union. So in terms of scale, the difference is radical. And this radical difference produces a very interesting outcome. In terms of the practicable rights, it's no secret that the European Union actually gives us more than the nation states that formed the European Union, which means that if you just look at the list, all the rights are the same. But if you think about the scale of rights, the European rights are potentially much more far-reaching than the national rights. And this is all a positive picture. So you think, this is great. We created the European Union. We are boosting the rights that are present at the national level, and somehow this is nothing really radically new. It's just a different scale. And I beg to disagree with that kind of approach, because once you think about what citizenship and rights in a modern liberal democratic system are about, the answer is always along the lines of what Jacopo presented. You're not viewed as fully participating unless you vote. To me, it's very simplistic. As a professor at Bristol, Jacopo, of course, is a much more vivid participant in the shaping of the political sphere in the UK than the majority of British citizens. So it's not the citizenship of voting that matters, but probably something else. And we need to discuss what. But what happens at the European level is that although there is no voting, there is one interesting principle that undoes the fundamentals of modern Western constitutionalism with one stroke of a pen. And that's non-discrimination on the basis of nationality. Just think about it. Europe is based on a legal principle that denies the ABC of constitutional existence of all the building blocks of the European Union. Because what is a constitutional state for? What is our liberal democracy for? It's to make sure that the people that is self-organizing and that is performing what it thinks is just in history can do it undisturbed. So France is for the French, Estonia is for the Estonians, just as the United States is for Americans. Imagine you show up at the US border with a Mexican passport and tell them, I'm proudly Mexican, you cannot discriminate against me. What? It's nonsense. This is not how modern states function. And yet, this is the starting point of the law of the European Union. So what does this mean if we paraphrase this? And I quote Gareth Davis, it means that the nationalities of the member states are abolished within the scope of application of EU law. You cannot speak about any significance of Spaniardness or of being a Pole if the law says nobody can be discriminated on the basis of the fact that that person holds that particular nationality. Which means that you want to hire someone in France and an Estonian guy applies, you cannot give a preference to a French. In fact, it will be a direct violation of precisely that supranational law that Van Kenten Laws told us applies to all of us to a larger extent, to a more important extent than the law of the nation states. And then the implications are quite clear. So you have this beautiful supranational citizenship, and suddenly it tells all the liberal democratic participants of the Union that the founding idea underpinning their statehood doesn't matter, and if it's repeated too frequently, actually it's a direct violation of the law. Try to say in front of the European institutions that you are building a better Spain for the Spanish people. It depends on how you do it, but it's illegal. Because you need to take everybody's interest into account. So just at the level of rights, it's all very beautiful. You get an additional level of rights. At the level of territory, it's even nicer. Estonia becomes continent-wide. And in the Dutch border, our constitutional system is built. And the European Union is against that. And for the better of the people, we can add. Because of course, Diego was disturbed by not voting, but in fact, his territory of rights before the UK left and his scope of rights as a European on top of being an Italian was so significantly higher, so significantly more important than just of any Italian in Italy that I think it would potentially allow us to rethink what European statehood is about. And there was a famous book, I don't remember the author now, I should be deeply ashamed, but it's a great book which I remember the title of, From States to Member States, which means that a member state of the European Union, although it seems like a state, it has a flag, it has all kinds of stuff, at the theoretical and also at the practical level, it cannot be compared to any modern sovereign state anywhere else outside of the Union. Because the underlying thinking that is mandated by EU law is radically different. And that underlying thinking is non-discrimination based on nationality. So this is the positive side of the story. And now let's look at how it works in practice. And in practice, it's kind of bizarre, because if you can justify walking away from the essential features of liberal democratic constitutionalism in the name of expanding the territory of rights and also enlarging the scope of the rights that citizens get otherwise, and of course with a certain level of abstraction from political rights for obvious reasons. And it's not that I endorse it, this is simply how the system is built. On this I fully agree with Jacopo. The trouble is not everybody among Europeans gets those rights. And here the most important thing is not actually, and this is a footnote that comes last in the key textbooks on EU integration, but it's the most important element that helps us to understand how the legal system works. And that is that there is no equality before the law as a founding principle of the European Union. I know it's a far-reaching statement, but let's look at how EU law works. If Jacopo goes from Italy to France, for instance, and he finds a job, and he is, well, from Italy to the Netherlands, even further. He finds a job, he contributes to the taxes, he's establishing a good life, he doesn't vote, but he doesn't care. The Netherlands is a monarchy anyway, many other people don't vote there. But he's co-shaping a society. And then he falls in love with someone in Colombo, far away, not inhabited by white people. And the Dutch law prohibits importation of spouses from non-white spaces. There's a flat ban. Of course, it's not put in law in racist terms, but the outcome of the application of the ban, and it works in such a way, your future spouse has to pass a basic Dutch exam in the consulate in the state where she or he is from. Try to learn Dutch in Colombo and pass that exam. There is zero inflow of people under this kind of regulation. So, and since the boundary is race-based, this is a race-based rule, I think. So what Jacopo will be facing is that let's make it more complicated. He has a neighbor in the same apartment who is only Dutch, who is in love with the same woman, and then they are. I didn't know that. No, for instance, and then they are competing for the heart of that woman, saying, "Look, my love, we will bring you to the Netherlands. It's paradise. It's absolutely excellent. Great cuisine, great weather, excellent salaries, low tax rate. Come." And then they find out that actually Jacopo is the only person who can bring that future spouse into the Netherlands. Why? Because EU law makes sure that Dutch law doesn't apply. So the neighbor who is a Dutch person in the Netherlands will be covered by Dutch law, and the same situation of Jacopo and his spousal happiness will be covered by European law. I guess you get who wins the heart of the lady. But then the issue is EU law doesn't apply to everybody in the EU. Simply being a citizen doesn't matter. What the EU looks at is the individual situation and the concrete lines on the CV of every person. And then non-discrimination on the basis of nationality disappears. Because of the games that the court engages in with the substantive scope of the law, which means that no European can know for sure, unless you never moved anywhere, whether the law will apply to him or her or not. And this is a a different idea of liberty. This is a different idea of freedom, because what we have as the dominant trope after the French Revolution, at least, is that the law should apply in the same way to all the classes and all the parts of society, and this is exactly the main gain of modern constitutionalism. This is the starting point of what modern constitutionalism is about. This is what makes voting possible, because it's one person, one respected human being. It's basic respect that underpins citizenship. The European Union doesn't offer that. And then where do we need to go from here? We need to understand what is the basis on which this basic respect is actually extended. And here we come to morally and ethically vacant musings about the importance of the internal market. Why did Jacopo win the heart of that lady from Colombo? Only because he bothered to buy a train ticket and go all the way to the Netherlands where the weather is better, and then register at the local municipality. The only difference is movement in space. So in the European Union, you are either excluded or included within the ambit of the law based on physical movement. This is something that no other constitutional system provides. Of course, you can simply change jurisdictions. You can move from France to the Philippines, and then Philippine law will apply. But here in Europe, it's a different situation. It's not that Dutch law applies to Jacopo in the Netherlands. European law applies, and the Dutch precisely doesn't. And this is exactly what creates the inequality situation between Jacopo and his neighbor, and wins the heart of the lady. So then, what did the medievals think about liberty? They thought that liberty is an exact apportionment of rights that corresponds to how distinguished you are, usually by blood, but also by some other engagements in society. And then that kind of idea of liberty, which is deeply stratifying and which is deeply antagonistic to the idea of equality before the law, was replaced with the liberty that underpins citizenship. All the citizens are equal between one another. And the European Union is a neo-medieval reinvention of the pre-citizenship reality where your legal status in the polity cannot possibly matter. So to me, it's not the rights, it's the boundary between different scopes of the law that is the place to look in order to understand what the European people, as currently constructed by the law, is about. And this is where all the troubles start, because the European Union does not only humiliate the states, and this is again Professor Davis, who wrote the humiliation of the state as EU's main constitutional tactic. Why is that? By making sure that Dutch law doesn't apply to Jacopo, the European Union basically spits at the Dutch, however filthy, but still a democratic system. So if the democratic system thinks that such kind of mixed marriages across the race boundary is something that the Dutch don't want, it's not up to the European Union to decide that in fact some guys who have moved an ethically and morally irrelevant act should be accepted from the application of the rightful outcome of the Dutch democratic process. And this is exactly what the European Union is doing. So the non-discrimination based on nationality is then not only about extending rights, it's also, as applied, an attack on the very idea of equality before the law. And the last point, and I close. So then, for all purposes that could be of relevance to a legal theorist, there is no citizenship in the EU. There is a supranational status that mounts a very powerful attack against the ABC of constitutionalism at the national level, because the idea of supranational law combined with irrelevant factors that underpin the activation of that law as opposed to national law mean that every single European constitution lies. When the French constitution tells you the French citizens are free, this is nonsense. Because there are people like Jacopo. Because a French person can go to Belgium and return and will not fall within the scope of French law. And French constitution has nothing to do with it. And in fact, there are dozens of thousands and hundreds of thousands of these people in Europe. So the whole idea of equality before the law is not only killed at the supranational level, it's also killed at the national level. And this is what the EU is about. And now my last point, which I promised to make, and that is that there are also others. All the non-Europeans who find their way to Europe, and there are hundreds of thousands of them, actually more than 30 million, are not, by definition, not within the scope of EU law. And this means that no matter how legal you are, how lawful is your stay, you are never granted any rights from the supranational level that would make the supranational level meaningful for you. So you will always be an Estonian resident in Estonia. You will never be an Estonian resident in the European Union. And I stop here.
I'm going to bring you now to a much darker place than from what Dimitry and Jacopo told you. So if you thought that this was hell, you have seen nothing yet. I would like to speak about and to say a few words about third country nationals, not non-EU citizens. And I first would like to tell you 3 very brief stories. The first story is from Mohammed. We were in the water for 13 hours. My wife, Shifa, 30, and our 2 children, a 9-month-old Assam and a 5-year-old Abdul Wahab, were alive with me right up to the last hour. After that, I could do no more. Can you imagine that they die while I was holding them? I don't understand why I didn't die with them. So this is a testimony and a story from Mohammed, whose wife and children died in the Mediterranean while crossing the sea, and who basically reached Italy afterwards. They were kicking me in the legs with electric things, long sticks. I felt so much pain, and I felt nothing at the same time. They hit me all over my body. I was screaming and shouting. They said, if you don't want to go back, we will hit you so much that we will force you to leave. This is an anonymous testimony from a migrant who got caught up at the Belarusian-Latvian border 2 years ago, and who were basically tortured by the Latvian authorities. This is from a report of Amnesty International. Then they entered the prison with a stick and were beating people like animals. Sometimes they would take your money and good clothes. They broke my teeth, so I accepted return. This is a story from someone who got caught up in a prison in Libya after being pushed back by the Greek authorities while trying to cross the Mediterranean. These are not only 3 stories. These are stories of more or less, nowadays for, I think, 9 years, more or less, 27,000 people. 27,000 people, and even more, because only 27,000 people disappeared into the Mediterranean, but of course there are much more who ended up at the Belarusian border, being pushed back, being tortured, the same regarding people who ended up in the Libyan prison, being tortured, raped, and sometimes killed as well. This is what's happening at all borders, here at EU borders. And we have to ask ourselves, how is that possible? Do 27,000 people die in the water by chance? Does that happen by chance that all of these people are black? And our answer, it's actually a paper that we co-wrote with Dimitry, is that no, this doesn't happen by chance. This is what we call EU lawlessness law. We argue that the EU, in concert with member states, has put in place legal techniques which allow for all of these people to die in the Mediterranean. These legal techniques are put in place to make sure that the rights owed by the third country national, by these racialized others, are rendered ephemeral and unusable in practice. All the rights in the books are denied in practice. We argue that there are 4 techniques. There are 4 techniques which constitute, if you want, a web, which makes these things possible. The first technique is the fact that the EU is moving international agreements outside the law. This is a process of informalization of international law. So you have, if you want, most of the time, when the EU wants to conclude deals with third countries, they are most of the time in the realm of international law, with procedural guarantees and substantial guarantees, including the respect of human rights. What the EU is doing here, it's concluding deals, including what we call cash for migrants deals, with Libya, with Tunisia, with Egypt, very recently, 2 days ago in fact, pouring and showering these countries with money in order for this country to make sure that they retain all the migrants and that the migrants even don't try to cross the Mediterranean or even like to chase them in the Mediterranean in the case of the Libyan thugs and bringing them back to their shadow prisons. How is that possible, you will tell me, is that these deals are what we call soft law deals, meaning that they are outside the law, meaning that they are just political agreements, that these are not like legally binding, meaning that they don't have to abide to the procedural rules on the one hand, neither the substantial rights and human rights on the other hand. You also have this example with the readmission agreements. What are these readmissions agreements? These readmissions agreements are basically agreements concluded with all of the countries all over the world, including Russia, the US, and other countries, where basically the EU agrees that if there is someone undocumented, the country will just like take back the undocumented migrants. And what's happening with all the migrants coming from the former colonies or from all these racialized countries, non-Western countries, is that the EU doesn't conclude this deal under the rules of international law. They just conclude these soft deals, which do not fall under the realm of international law, meaning that, again, all the substantive and procedural rights and procedural guarantees do not apply here. So you have these non-binding readmission agreements. Some of them even are not published. So they are not accessible. So in the case of Guinea, Ivory Coast, Gambia, for instance, we know that there are deals where basically the EU is just sending back a lot of people to these terrible dictatorships without even having the possibility to read what is in these political agreements. So this is basically a way for the EU to govern differently when it comes to the external dimension of migration, to bypass the law, to bypass procedural law, to bypass substantial law. And even when these deals are brought before the European Court of Justice, it's very interesting in the case of the EU-Turkey deal. Do you remember, like in 2015, 2016, we had this announcement of on the website of the Council saying, "How, we are so happy, we concluded this beautiful deal with Turkey, so we will shower 3 billion on Turkey, and we will make sure that Turkey will keep all these refugees we don't want on our territory. And also we will have this deal where we will, according to which we will send one bad refugee to Turkey, and Turkey will send one good refugee. We still don't know what it means, maybe a little bit less Muslim, maybe a little bit more Christian, but so the deal is there. The deal was basically attacked, like in front of the European Court of Justice, especially on the premises that it violates like the basic principle of non-refoulement, basic human rights law, international law. And the European Court of Justice, high priest of EU lawlessness law, said that, but in fact, this is not a deal which was concluded by the EU. This is a deal which was in fact concluded by each member state with Turkey, meaning that the action was inadmissible, meaning that the EU Court of Justice never said a word about the legality of this deal, which was like outside the realm of EU law. So the EU Court of Justice here, and it was highly criticized, like was really together like with the EU, was protecting the EU, making it impossible to hold the EU accountable for such deadly deals. This was so the first technique. The first technique, so bringing all these agreements outside the realm of EU law. The second technique is money. Like how to convince all these countries, Tunisia, Libya, Morocco, to keep all the migrants out. It's showering them with money. And you will tell me, but I cannot believe that with my money, with your money, in fact, most of the EU citizens in the room, like that such deadly things could be done. So you might ask me, how is that possible under the law? This is actually made and developed under the development banner. So the EU wants to reduce and eradicate poverty. And among this reduction and eradication of poverty in key countries, by chance it's Tunisia, Libya, Morocco, they put in place like some funds that they called like basically funds for emergency actions to attack the root causes of irregular migration. This was the case of the EU Trust Fund for Africa, put in place on the occasion of the Valletta Summit in 2015. This fund, which was more or less like 5 billion, was financed mainly by member states, Norway, Switzerland, and the EU Commission. But 90% of these funds comes from the EU Commission, is EU money. 1.5 billion of these funds, and even probably much more, serve to finance the shadow immigration system in Libya. What do I mean by the shadow immigration system in Libya? You have a lot of BBC documentary. You have an excellent article by Jan Urbina in The New Yorker, which was published in 2001, December 2001, I think, showing that, like, how does it work? Like, the Coast Guard, Frontex, Italian Coast Guard, Greek Coast Guard, called their Libyan friends patrolling the Mediterranean. The Libyan Coast Guard, on the way, take the migrants. Sometimes they kill them, sometimes they just imprison them. In prison, they call the family of the migrants in order for the family to pay ransom. If the family cannot pay ransom, migrants are still kept in prison. They sometimes die there, they sometimes are tortured, raped, etc. So, and this is all documented. How this is made possible? This is made possible because the EU pays the Libyan so-called, there is even no government, but the Libyan authorities there and the Libyan thugs patrolling into the Mediterranean. And they actively collaborate with them. So this is what it means when I speak about financing a shadow immigration system. There is also proof of the EU paying like some shopping lists of some people, some official from Niger, for instance. So from a legal perspective, because the EU is of course like a very regulated supranational entity, you can ask me, how is that possible from a legal perspective? Like, isn't it any mechanism of accountability where basically we could at least like check like what is done with this money? And again, like the international law agreement, we see that this money is brought outside of the EU budget. So outside any kind of possibility to check what this money is used for. So there is no accountability by design. And the way the Commission and member states have justified this is that, oh, there is so many emergencies to deal with. We basically need flexibility, which is indispensable to spend this money. This was criticized by the EU Ombudsman. This was criticized by the Court of Auditors. They kind of improved it a little bit, but still, the money was showered on all these dictatorships and people who are basically like criminals. So this is basically a transactional partnerships. Again, in order to externalize the systems with no human rights accountability whatsoever. And you could ask and say, and what about the goal of development? Because remember, this money is justified based on the fact that we need to help this country to develop. We need to help this country to get out of poverty. And it's interesting because when you read basics books on just inequalities and development, Bilanovic, among others, he explains that the main cause of global inequality nowadays are borders. And the fact that people cannot migrate to a country to another. So if actually we want this country to develop, we would need to develop a much more welcoming and open migration policy in order to allow them to be mobile and to come to the EU. So this is the first point. The second point is that most of the money that is spent in the name of development is of course spent in the key countries in terms of migration. And that this money is not spent on countries, especially African countries, which actually need the most this money because they are not key in terms of the migration route that the EU wants to tackle. So the EU Trust Fund of Africa came to an end 1.5 years ago, but projects are still financed because they are financed until 2026. And now it has been replaced by the Neighborhood Development and International Cooperation Instrument or fund. And so this continues basically, and this money is still spent with no accountability whatsoever. And again, very recently, 2 days ago, an agreement, political agreement was concluded with Egypt, agreeing on 8 billion deals, mainly tackling irregular migration. The third technique. The third technique is, you have all heard about Frontex. Frontex, this EU agency, which officially supports member states in managing external borders, return, and participate also in joint operation, whether at the border but outside the EU as well. It's very interesting to see the evolution of Frontex. Frontex, this EU agency, was created in 2004. And at first, it was not put in place in order to deal with the borders. It was put in place to deal only with, in migration at the border. It was put in place in order to deal with international crimes at the border. But then the agency got more and more power, more and more money. So just to give you an idea, in 2004, it started with 6 billion. Today, the budget is 900 billion. It has a lot of powers in terms of it has its own coast guards and its own people working at the borders, and it is involved. And there is a lot of proof in pushbacks and pullback of migrants in the Mediterranean. We also know that there is some involvement of Frontex at the EU-Belarusian border, but the issue is that there is a problem of transparency, because we don't have, a lot of information is not available. So we end up here with Frontex with a strong administrative body with significant operational capacity. And the problem is that over all these years, more money for Frontex, more powers, there was no safeguards to develop and to compensate this expansion. So we have this super powerful agency at the EU border, and we know that there are huge violations of human rights towards migrants. Frontex being involved in the killing, probably like also by proxy, like of the torture of migrants in Libya, etc., and nothing has been done so far. Is money is still available? It still has all the powers that the last regulation recognizes to Frontex. And how is that possible? How is that possible? Legally speaking, again, like always coming back to the law, but that's interesting to see how the laws, EU law allows that, is the problem of many hands. In all these operations, and especially when you have some kind of touchless and remote management with the drones from some private company just flying on top of the Mediterranean, these are the drones of Frontex. So paid by Frontex, sorry. So these drones basically like alert the Libyan Coast Guard in order to get all the migrants back to their territory. How do you determine the responsibility of actors in this situation? You have the company which is dealing with the drones. You have Frontex, which informs basically the Libyan Coast Guards about the position of migrants. You have the Libyan kind of, I don't know, states, if you can call that a state, which is also involved. And most of the time, you also have the Italian and the Greek authorities involved. And then you also have like the people in Brussels, like giving all this instruction and basically making all these regulations. This is the problem of many hands, which makes it impossible basically to identify who is responsible. The second problem is the total lack of transparency. We know from very courageous journalists, we know from the EU Ombudsman, we know from many organizations that there are huge human rights violations by Frontex. But we don't get most of the documents we need in order to prosecute and to show that there is an issue here. And there is also no external human rights monitoring, which would help to get all this information and to monitor like the Frontex in terms of its respect towards human rights. So this is another problem. And the third problem is the fact that the only court in front of which Frontex action against Frontex can be brought is the European Court of Justice. You cannot bring Frontex in front of the Spanish or the Italian or the Belgian court. The only court is the European Court of Justice. And so far, all the cases brought against Frontex, whether it's a failure to act or whether it's an action of damages, all failed. Why? Because the European Court of Justice is really reluctant to find any kind of responsibility of Frontex here, acting as the high priest of lawless law. The same as in the case of the EU-Turkey deal. So there is also here, I think, a responsibility of the European Court of Justice, which is really like staying behind the issue and is incapable to, as a court, take its responsibility in terms of the basic values and human rights which are protected by the EU. And then the last techniques is what we basically showed. It's the role of the Commission, the European Commission. As you know, the European Commission is the guardian of the treaty. And you could say, oh yeah, but if basically we see member states violating EU law, the Commission can bring an action of infringement against member states, against Italy, against Greece, against Latvia, against Lithuania. You have hundreds of pages showing that all these countries, the coast guards, are on a regular basis involved in pushbacks and pullback in tortures of migrants. Amnesty International, BBC, like the New Yorker, you have, like, everything is available. But the Commission is just like playing as it doesn't see anything worse. It praises this country. In the case of Lithuania, we know that there was a lot of torture and pushback which happened at the EU-Belarus border. The Commission started praising Lithuania for the way it deals with migrants. So the Commission is in total denial and in a laissez-faire approach, praising these countries which are being and acting criminal. So these are, I think I will stop here, and I'm happy to give more details about all these techniques. But I think it's very important to always ask ourselves, like, if we basically, as citizens, testify a really grave violation of human rights, and 27,000 people is not an accident, to ask what are the mechanisms behind, and what makes it possible, especially when it comes to a supranational entity like the EU, which is based, and which says that it is based on the rule of law and human rights and human dignity. And here I think there is a really huge issue, and if we are actually pro-European and pro-European project, I think we have the duty to try to dig into that, to denounce and to speak out about it. And there are some very smart students, very smart scholars, who have brought now an action in front of the International Criminal Court, who notified the International Criminal Court about the EU and about Mrs. von der Leyen and what's happening regarding the Mediterranean and the EU-Belarus border. So we will see how far it goes, because we know like how political the International Criminal Court is, but this is already a very strong signal, I think, which is brought here. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Sarah. That was great. Thanks to the three of you. I'm going to now open the floor, see if there are any questions or comments. Anyone would like? There's a microphone, right, that we can use for people here. Yeah, there's a question here. And if you guys can introduce yourselves when you can just tell us your name and where you're coming from. And
Mike Vincent from the University of Notre Dame. I got a question for you, Sarah, and I guess it's more, it's a broader question. Everybody can comment. You mentioned the main cause of inequality is borders. I know the African Union has been trying to establish their, well, they did establish their free movement of people protocol, but it hasn't been ratified. It hasn't been taken up much by a lot of the states. And I was wondering if, you know, all things being equal, it'd be better to have the European Union really support that as a first step. And yeah, that's the question.
thank you, Michael. Any other question that we have? Yes, one here.
Hi, my name is Alyssa, and I'm also from the University of Notre Dame, and this question is also for Sarah, very popular today. I was wondering, so you mentioned that the court in the Turkey-EU deal decided that it was not the EU who made the decision, the deal, but rather each individual state. I was wondering what factors the court considered or what made the decision turn on that, and whether you see countries acting in that way to, in the future, get the similar result of the deal being between countries rather than the EU as a whole.
Thank you. Should we start with those two? Well, we'll see if anyone else would like to. So I think the first one goes
okay,
for
so I reply,
Sarah
okay, excellent.
and also the rest of the panel.
I guess you can also
yeah, you can
jump in.
start, Sarah, perhaps.
Thank you so much for the questions, the great questions. That's actually a really great question, the question of freedom of movement in African Union, and I didn't even know that there is now like negotiation about this freedom of movement. I think that the EU will never support that, because freedom of movement will allow basically like the migrations towards the north. And we see actually in all these like consequences of the externalization of migration management by the EU, one of the terrible consequences is that why some borders in Africa used to be open, they are now closed by some countries because they want to like they want to just like make sure that migrants do not come to their own country in order to cross the Mediterranean. But a lot of migration there is just like circular migration within Africa. So in terms of, I don't know, like just like doing like some, yeah, it's not freedom of movement because there is no freedom of movement, but it was a very important part of the economy there. And now there are like disastrous consequences because especially of the European Union like pushing in order for this country to make sure that all these migrants will never basically try to cross the Mediterranean and arrive in the EU. So I think the EU will never support this. And I think that it would be a great development for Africa to have this freedom of movement. And I don't know all the specificities of the region enough because I don't work on that. But it's really interesting to see like the kind of the collateral like damages like regarding this not freedom of movement but at least movement in Africa in general. Yeah. And for your question, also a great question. Here it was only strategic. Like it was basically the council which argued that it was not. It's basically here, like basically the council, like and the EU, like concluding the agreement with each member states, which makes it impossible to dispute the argument, the agreement. Because now if you go to Belgium, you can say to Belgium, oh, but Belgium basically, like you concluded an agreement which goes against human rights and which is unlawful. If the constitutional Belgian court says that, then what? There is no consequences. All the money which was poured on Turkey came from the EU Commission. So what can Belgium do? It's just really, and it's why we call it EU law, less law. It's really like basically like emptying all the law of all the possibilities for these migrants to get the rights recognized and implemented. And I think this EU-Turkey deal is such a good example of this. And I also think that there is an active part of the European Court of Justice in basically covering all of this. It's a very sensitive subject, but that's why we call it high priest of EU less law. A lot of people would say that we are very radical, like saying that, but I think there is an active role of the European Court of Justice really like taking part in this like covering Frontex, covering the EU, and it's really damageable for the EU in itself. So some people will say, no, the EU Court of Justice is only passive. Like it's just because it doesn't have enough tools in order to... No, that's not true. There is an active role. And here, like from a legal perspective, it was not legally sound, the way like the EU Court of Justice developed it. And there is another very interesting case, which is called Access Europe, where NGOs ask the Council to disclose some very important document regarding this EU-Turkey deal. And this is like based on an action of transparency that you can bring in front of the European Court of Justice. So this document would have been like key to show that this was concluded between the EU and Turkey and not between member states and Turkey. And the European Court of Justice said, oh no, like there is no obligation to disclose such documents, which is really interesting to see how it developed basically. But thanks for your question.
Could I jump in very quickly?
Yeah, absolutely.
And just to build immediately on the same, I think Mike's question really goes to the core of what we're talking about. The borders in Africa are, to a huge degree, the EU's doing. The EU is pumping a lot of money into those borders, and undoing those borders is something that it officially recommends. But of course, in Africa, we have ECOWAS. And ECOWAS more or less works. So we already have successful examples which don't go to the level of citizenship. The African Union wanted African citizenship. Even the first passports were issued. And I think the widow of Nelson Mandela used that passport. It's the only known example, if I'm not mistaken. But moving to Alisa, if we go to the core of how EU law works, recently, in the last 10, 15 years, it doesn't actually operate, and I regret to say that, as a legal system, because you can always have a political agreement outside of the law that actually annuls all the primary law principles on which the EU is said to be based. So if you don't want, if you don't want the basic rule of law, if you don't want human rights protection, if you don't want any other foundational aspects of EU's existence, the existence of supranational law, what you can now do, you can simply rename the meeting of the Council as a meeting among the member states and proclaim that the Court of Justice shouldn't have jurisdiction. A job of any proper constitutional court would be to go behind the names and actually to find out what was going on. And this is not the task that the Court of Justice has taken upon itself. Even worse, the Court of Justice is protecting this lawless system against any kind of external scrutiny. So, of course, the principle of supremacy of EU law makes it impossible or very difficult for the national courts to intervene, although they are trying on substance. So, last week there was a decision of an Italian Corte di Cassazione where they are sending to jail a captain of an Italian ship for bringing migrants back to Libya. This is a criminal offense in Italy. In fact, this is a criminal offense anywhere in the EU, unless you are Ms. von der Leyen and other commissioners, plus countless officers who establish a whole system of gross human rights violations, which make sure that dozens of thousands of people are killed because of the successful operation of EU law. And now, just to bring it home, the complacency of the court vis-à-vis the member states went as far as approving the member states' own mingling with the court's composition. When Brexit happened, one of the advocates general, who also had a British citizenship, stayed on after Brexit because that office of a member of the court is not ruled by the same criteria as the judgeships of the court. So Advocate General Sharpson was given a number of important cases to deliver opinions on, and then suddenly the member states decided to replace her, although her mandate was far from over. There was still one year to go. How do they do it? They simply use a political agreement in the form of a letter among the member states that in the eyes of the court has overruled somehow the primary law on the composition of that very body. And of course, since the court is strongly active against any kind of scrutiny from the European Court of Human Rights, the other main court in Europe, Article 6 CCHR, which is the due process of law, doesn't apply to this kind of things. So then what happened? Advocate General Sharpston's driver received a short text message asking to deliver the car back to the garage since the person behind was not a member of the court anymore, while primary law guaranteed one more year of her service, and she was actually traveling to the Court of Justice. So this kind of things would be unthinkable in any European democracy at the national level. And here I come to the main point. The European Union now serves, it's one of its functions, a new function which was not envisaged by the drafters, by the founders of the Union, by the drafters of the treaties, and that is to provide a lawless shield against any kind of accountability for the actions of the member states which go against their constitutional principles. Can you kill 27,000 people and be okay under the French constitution and criminal law? No. And the same applies to all the other member states, even Hungary, even Poland. Like, however backwards you are backsliding in terms of democracy, this would not be possible. You simply don't kill 27,000 people. And the European Union makes it possible, and you will be receiving decorations from the member states for that, and you will be presented as doing your job as if nothing has happened. So this is a very, very, very dangerous development which presents the Union in a totally different light. So in this sense, when I saw the UK Supreme Court ruling against the Rwanda deal, we will see what happens next, I very much regretted that in the EU we don't actually have a court. Because no court will ever bring down an outright lawless deal based on any kind of obvious arguments, because the Court of Justice doesn't see it as its main task. So we don't have a court in a legal system which doesn't behave as a legal system. Of course, we can limit it to killing 27,000 people, but I think that is already enough.
And exactly on this point, I mean, I would like to highlight that this is exactly one of those kind of immunitary mechanisms that the European Union is built to actually enforce. So we pay the price of, this kind of interpenetration within European Union of the different system. We pay the price of letting foreigners, European foreigners, white foreigners within our borders. But on the other hand, the European Union is basically doing the dirty job for us. It's a kind of almost Mephistophelic pact that the European Union is introducing. And it is very, very worrying that the European Union does, which is, a kind of system based on a supranational, like more expansive idea of a rule of law, is failing exactly when it should work on those issues and should bring the member states to a much more reasonable and humane relationship with the foreigners.
Any questions? Yeah, I see one more there, one more here. So we have two more.
Thank you. Thanks to all of you for this wonderful presentation. So I have two questions related to Frontex. One is related to the role of the, kind of say, soft accountability by the EU Ombudsman, for instance, and looking at its last report, the inquiry outcome. So do you think that the role of the Ombudsman is really effective, and do you believe in its potential to make changes in the agency, at least some adjustments, as the judgments so far were not capable of that? And coming to the judgment of WS and the appeal that is now being discussed, do you have faith on this appeal? What will be the outcome? What can we expect on that? So thank you so much.
Thank you. We have one more here.
Sure. So as an American, I guess my perspective is different, but it seems like a lot of what you're discussing is, and the reason that it seems so insular is because there's a premise that if all of these non-European immigrants come to Europe, they would cause problems or not be able to assimilate. That seems to be at least the fear. And I guess this is a hypothetical, but what would you expect to happen if there was a really easy way to get into Europe, or vice versa, and free movement in Africa? Would you expect to see a huge influx of immigrants, or how would you envision that?
Any other? Cristina?
Hello, I'm Cristina Cortázar, University Comillas, Madrid. And first of all, thank you very much for all your presentations. I found it really very interesting. I'm so happy to see Dimitry again.
Great pleasure.
Many years from our last time. And my question could be for all you, but especially for you, Dr. Gante. Is Gante? Yeah, sorry.
Yeah.
It's on. Well, I am very concerned with the future. It's not on your presentation, but it is related with. So if you want to answer, or some of you, I'm quite concerned with the future interplaying between the screening regulation of the European Pact on Migration and Asylum, the interplay with the border procedures, and how these two regulations will be applied regarding with the protection of human rights of third country nationals trying to enter through the borders, and also with the special clauses inside the on instrumentalization that will be inside the regulation of crisis of the so-said pact, migration pact. Thank you very much.
Thank you. There's another question. Yeah, well, let's collect one more question, and we'll close with your answers.
Hello.
Yeah, hi.
Thank you for the presentations. My name is Laura. I'm from Brazil, and I work with global mobility in general. I would like to ask you about because 2024 is the year of European Parliament elections, and we see a trend that more let's say, extremist MPs will be elected. So my question is, if you think this will impact, policies in general, but in migration in the EU, not only because of this direct impact, but also because the EU is kind of upholding the narrative that EU citizens, they want a more strict regulations on that and are against free movement, and so I think it's like a general question for every one of you. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura. I think your question and the one by Maria Jose is about who gives us hope, right? So we used to think about the court and the commission as independent actors. Obviously, the European Parliament was always very vocal, but with the elections, with the upcoming elections, that might be different. There will still be some MPs, obviously, working on this, like Tineke Strik, and I don't know if she's running again, or others, right? But the courts at national level cannot do anything from what you guys are explaining. So who provides us with some hope?
That's a very good question, and I'm realizing, like now talking to you, that indeed I depicted, and probably like also Jacopo and Dimitry are not a very like optimistic image about the EU, but I think it's true. But who gives us hope? Maybe we see, like, it's interesting what you're saying about the European parliaments, because in the European parliaments it has been active, but just only a few members. No. So when you see really like Tineke Strik and a few others like from the Green Party, but there are not that many people active on these issues at the European Parliament, which is kind of interesting. So as long as we have these few individuals there, like being extremely vocal and making, like they're doing such a great job, so this is, and I think to answer your question about this soft accountability, I think it's a good question. I don't believe the EU Ombudsman will change anything like specifically, but I think it participates in that, and I think it's doing a really great job. I think it takes like whatever like competence and power it has not much, but at least it's an official like institution from the EU, and it publishes, it investigates, it does a really good job, and in that sense participates in denouncing like what's happening. And having these voices coming like from the NGOs, like coming from even like a journalist from abroad, like more and more scholars are also like writing against, like this is slowly coming, but there are really it's not only us, like there are really a lot of scholars doing an amazing job on that. And so having all these people like being more and more vocal, I hope, but maybe it's too much, I hope that the European Court of Justice will at one point in this appeal, because there is this actions of damages against Frontex in the WS case, but there are many other cases against Frontex, of course, like we'll feel the pressure that it's becoming really untenable. And I think we are reaching this point where I cannot believe that we can continue that unless indeed the European elections like brings us a really much worse kind of picture, and we see, like even with the project of the long-term residence directive, which was this proposal which was on the table, and to come back to Jacopo's point, which really wanted, in a sense, to have a way of seeing like European integration as an ensemble. So saying that third country nationals, when they are long-term residents, will be able, for instance, to accumulate periods in different states in order to get the long-term residence permit, or even if they want to move to another state, they only have to reside, I think, 2 or 3 years in order to get a new long-term residence permit in another state. So there was really this vision of, let's make it a more kind of consistent entity and a more consistent ensemble. And it basically, the council decided just to give up on the project. So we see that the very few positive steps now are kind of being abandoned and taken back. And Christina, thank you so much for your question regarding the EU Migration Pact. So the EU Migration Pact, which was adopted in November, this is a really worrying turn, because I didn't speak about it in my presentation, but now you have EU law, less law in EU law, in EU hard law. What I mean by that is that EU law now allows to have what we call the fiction of entry. It was inspired by our Australian colleagues. So basically, like asylum seekers who would enter the EU territory would be deemed as not having entered the EU territory, meaning that no rights whatsoever in the directives in the EU Charter of Fundamental Rights are applied to them. So you have basically EU law versus law, which will appear now in EU law saying, oh, in fact, like we can just send back these people because it's like they haven't entered the EU. So this is the next step of the EU law less development that we see now coming. So yeah, this is something, and maybe just the hope, and I think this is the way of hope. And to answer your question, Alexander, it's the EU is getting old. The EU is getting old, and at one point we will really need this migration. And we see more and more countries, and it's very interesting, such as Hungary, for instance. Like Orban is absolutely like xenophobic. He doesn't like foreigners, and he is absolutely anti-Muslim, etc. And we see these countries who really need migrants and third country nationals, and we see more and more migrants coming. It's true, not from Muslim countries, but the development from each member state are different, but from India, for instance, from China. And I suspect that at one point the EU will be, oh my God, we need someone to work for us in order to pay our pensions. So the model, as it is working now, just focusing on highly skilled migrants and then leaving with these people dying in the water, it's not sustainable. And a sustainable model would be more mobility. Because there is also this vision that migrants coming from Africa want to stay and live forever in Europe. And I think this is an extremely Eurocentric vision of ourselves, thinking that we are so great that everybody wants to come and live here. No, they just want to have a better life. But having a better life, especially in our global world, doesn't mean like to settle somewhere. It means that, yeah, maybe getting a job, participate in the economy, and then moving somewhere, so getting a better passport, then moving somewhere else. And so we should, I think, stop seeing like this kind of migration or immigration policies as something like where we settle, but we need to think about it in terms of mobility. And once we will be able to think it in terms of mobility, I think that things will slowly change, a bit like in the EU in the end. It's the same. So we need more mobility. And I hope that the EU will understand that. Yeah.
Could I jump in very quickly?
Yes, absolutely.
To Maria Jose especially, we need to change the kind of discourse we have about the ongoing criminal actions which kill dozens of thousands of people. So it's not about, let's hope that someone will succeed in the appeal against Frontex and receive 500 euros. Let's look, instead of case-by-case basis, let's look at the core of the problems. The core of the problems is that the European Commission, in collusion with the member states and other institutions, is mounting a full-fledged criminal attack against the essence of EU law. We cannot frame it differently when 27,000 people are proven dead because of the result of a carefully designed policy. This is a criminal policy, and instead of hoping for accountability in one case, we need to speak critically about this policy. And it would be impossible to have this at the national level without the EU. So the EU is clearly used as a shield in order to commit mass crimes, while nobody's speaking about accountability. All those people who were involved in designing this should be behind bars. Criminal law should apply. Where is it? It's not simply a political decision to disregard the law, like the Turkey deal. Of course, the EU would like to believe that the law doesn't matter and it can take a political decision to kill en masse. But this is not how any rule of law-based state works. We are not even speaking about liberal democracies. I mean, I would never make a far-reaching statement that the EU is a democracy. That's precisely part of the problem. Because when people vote, they would say, we don't want von der Leyen because we don't want the dead bodies. But they are not given this choice. And this doesn't filter through to the national level. So in this sense, going to Laura's question, it's very difficult to be optimistic because there is no political divide in the EU since it's not a democracy. It doesn't matter Whether those European Parliament elections actually are held or not, it doesn't matter for this issue, because the European Parliament has no sway on this. The European Parliament cannot change the way how the criminal clique functions, who has been killing only non-white people, by the way, for the last 10 years. If you look at the death toll, it's similar to the number of non-soldiers killed by Putin in Ukraine. And I think numbers matter, because however horrid Putin's deeds, we should be able to compare the numbers. And in fact, to say we set aside the law in order to kill 27,000 black people and promise not to do it again if we are successful in dissuading migration through killing, this shouldn't work like this. So I think a wholesome and complete reframing of how we view our own crimes, which are committed, funded by billions from our own pockets, is something that is an indispensable step, especially in a non-democracy, especially when there are elections. So this non-democracy, and I go back to what we discussed in the previous round of questions, this non-democracy is shielding the member states who are of course complacent and who of course are co-creators of the system from any kind of accountability in their own national system, because they can always point to the Court of Justice, and we know that the Court of Justice is not capable of giving a lifelong sentence to Ms. von der Leyen for this kind of policy. This is the law. And I have a small paper on this with Elena Bashevska, which is called "Does Illiberalism Matter?" And we present this question as non-political because there is an overwhelming consensus, it seems, that the European Union should be non-accountable and non-democratic in order to allow national democracies to do whatever they want, even if those actions are criminal. And this is the tragedy of the whole construct. And then now this small ray of hope, and I shut up. We need to abolish the Bosphorus presumption as soon as possible, because this fiction of entry, etc., this might be put into the law by the European Parliament, helping the Criminal Commission to eliminate migration flows in direct breach of the law. The Court of Justice will never throw away that migration pact, because the Court of Justice doesn't exercise constitutional review. In fact, if you look at the practice, it's not in theory. So if you don't have a court exercising constitutional review, someone else should, if this constitutional review is absolutely indispensable in order to stop the radical and constant breaches of the law. And here the European Court of Justice European Court of Human Rights could help. So the European Court of Human Rights is the only hope at this point, unless we really change the discourse.
Well, yeah, Jacopo, and then we'll have one final question and two final questions.
Just a very brief point on hope, on law and hope. There is this quote from the movie The Hand of God of Sorrentino, where the protagonist is talking to another of the protagonists of the story, and this phrase is uttered: "Hope is a trap." Hope is a trap because it makes you think of an alternative world that might never happen. And this is, absolutely true. And so I would be a little bit wary about hope. But on the other hand, there is also this other understanding of hope, of why we should be hopeful. Because hope, I think, and this is an idea that I'm developing currently, it is the fundamental element of any pouvoir constituant. If you do not have hope, if you do not have an open space where you can imagine an alternative future, then you cannot really create anything. And in this sense, we need to have hope that the European Union will change, but also we need to remember ourselves that we are in a trap of hope, because the European Union has always presented itself as an agent for change, as an agent for a better future. But the way it is structured right now, as both Sarah and Dimitry have amply shown, is actually a kind of vicious machine, a vicious circle that has created a kind of central lack of accountability that serves everybody. It serves the survival of the European Union on the basis of the instrumental use that member states are making of it. So on the one hand, we should hope. On the other hand, hope is really a trap in the case of the current state of the European Union.
Very brief last two questions because we're almost out of time. I will go first here and then Carsten.
Okay, I have actually two questions.
Yeah.
Sorry for that. I don't want to change the topic too much, but it's coming back to what Sarah said before. You said the population of the European Union is getting older and we need probably migration. Which kind of profiles do you think we need and how can we attract them? To migrate to us? This is one of my questions. And the other one is a little bit of change of topic, but we were talking about the rights of the European, or people living in the European Union. What about the obligations that we have when, for example, just putting myself as an example, Spanish, but I'm living in Germany. What are my obligations as a non-German person living there? Yeah, those are my questions.
And Carsten, final question.
So it's kind of for all of you, but it really hinges off of something that Dr. Gante said. It was that the number one obstacle to emerging out of poverty is the border. And on an individual level, allowing a single person to enter would raise them and raise their prosperity. Likewise, creating conditions within the country of origin that would foster prosperity would raise the quality of life and lower poverty. What is the role in the EU and their duties in ensuring raising non-European citizens out of poverty and creating good externalities for those who cannot come to the EU? Or is it just to allow entry?
Okay, great. So we'll conclude there. Who would like to start? Would you like to say any final word, Jacopo? So we'll go the other way around, or whoever wants to start. If you.
Let's start with Jacopo.
Let's start with Jacopo.
All right, well, I would like to say something about the duty that, I mean, I think that Dimitry has a lot of say on this, but we should, I think, distinguish from a duty that are forced on us and duty that are intrinsic to what it means to be part of something. Let's take the example of a family. In a family, you have a duty towards the other member of a family, duty to care, to love. However, it would be very weird and counterproductive to understand this duty as a kind of duty forced on you. If you don't want to take on that duty, then you have a very mistaken understanding of what it means to be part of something. So, can we force duty on European citizens so that they will belong more to a given community? That is, of course, a completely mistaken way of understanding what should be the relationship of communal integration between people. Again, I think that the duty of a European people moving from one country to the other should be the one of participating substantially to the life of the community there is in. And in this sense, I think that, and this is something that probably I should have said about your intervention, again, one thing is to be a member of a community that is not touched in a negative way by that community, living my life, having my daily routine, having conversation, even trying maybe to influence my students in the ways that I think are ethically valuable. But one of the things is actually to start, again, asking accountability for those political mechanisms which I'm part of. And in this sense, the political participation is the kind of right/duty that I think would be needed in order for the European Union to have that hope that we're talking about and to reconstitute a pouvoir constituant that was never there to begin with.
There is a beautiful article by Professor Jopke, very short, Liberal Citizenship is Duty-Free. This is the ABC of citizenship if we don't understand it in Stalinist terms. And all those who don't feel like doing things, or those who don't feel like belonging, in fact, they don't. And it's absolutely their choice. So I think any kind of talk of duties is deeply antagonistic to the whole idea of rights that we connect with citizenship. So on this, I fully agree. I fully agree with Jacopo. And obliging someone to belong or even to vote is likely to be counterproductive, because if those who are disinterested should be allowed to be disinterested. And I say it as a former Soviet citizen. In the end, it doesn't matter whether 100% or 87% voted for Putin. It doesn't become a better democracy. And if it doesn't work for Putin, why should it work for the European Union? So I think citizenship is a status of liberty and equality before the law, something that doesn't work in the EU but should. And there is no place for duties in it. And in terms of how do we attract them, the world is spatialized, and there are spaces of opportunity, spaces of no opportunity. The majority of spaces are spaces of no opportunity. And the only function of citizenship today is to make sure that the barriers surrounding the people assigned by blood to the space of no opportunity are impenetrable. So we have to break those barriers, and they will come simply because if you look at the glass ceilings doing the same job with the same qualifications in the Democratic Republic of Congo compared with Brazil, it gives you a 5,000 times difference in terms of salary scale, and it will be 50,000 if you compare with the United States. So someone is 50,000 times poorer. His life is or her life is shorter, and the whole context doesn't allow the person to develop simply because of being locked in the former Belgian colony. Of course, we deny any kind of responsibility. And then opening the border will allow those who want a different life to have that different life. So I think that there can be no question whether migration should happen or not. The EU has been very helpful, very lucky with, very lucky and unlucky with the war in Ukraine, because there are millions of Ukrainians who will never leave, and they will alleviate the pressure a little bit, making it less evident and less obvious in the immediate future that the EU needs a different approach to migration. But the racist approach that the EU is taking on the eastern border is absolutely unsustainable, because the same border is locked for the black people and open for the white people. And at the same time, we know that the majority of the non-white people at that border come from the places which used to be occupied and unlawfully invaded precisely by the member states who keep the border locked for those non-white people. So Poland participated in the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. Nothing was cleared under international law. So these states keep on torturing the populations which they have already have blood on their hands, and they keep on non-extending any kind of basic legal protections to them while they do to Ukrainians, which means that welcome the refugees from the places which you yourself have not invaded. Seems to be the principle that the European Union adheres to.
Sarah, would you like to say something?
No, just to add maybe half a sentence to that. And in order to reach what Dimitry has just explained, we need to have a conversation about race and colonialism, what we have never had the chance to have here in the European Union. And I think this is really missing. And once we will be able to like face it and to have that conversation, I think that we will be able to change our migration system. But as long as we are in a denial regarding this racism, which is like basically everywhere in all the migration policies, and also with the historical colonial past, we won't be able to change that. So let's have that conversation.
Thank you very much to the three of you. That has been absolutely wonderful.
Thank you, Diego.
And thanks to everybody who has come, and also to those who were online. We had a few viewers online as well. Thank you very much, guys.
Thank you. Thank you.